For this trick, we'll be teaching our dogs to discriminate different objects, and in this case, I am using different toys. So to start, we got to introduce our dog to our first object. I like to use some shaping, so I like to put that object on the floor, and without saying anything, if my dog interacts with that toy, I'm going to click and reward. I'm going to ignore any other behaviors that they may be offering at this time, as you can see here. And I am not giving the toy at this point any kind of verbal. I just want the dog to interact with it, me click and give them lots of rewards. Once we've done this a handful of times, I'm going to start to give it a word. And also you will see I'm asking my dog to actually pick up that object and bring it back to me. You don't have to do that in order to complete the trick. They can just pick it up or just nose at it, but make sure you're clear with your criteria. So then you start to introduce a second object, and I introduce that again alone and in the exact same manner, where the object is just placed on the floor, the dog interacts with it, click reward. And again, you don't have to have them retrieve it. If you don't want them to retrieve it, you can actually reward at the object, where I would go out to the frisbee in this case and reward at it. So now that we've got our understanding, we're going to add our verbal cue to whatever the object name is going to be. Make sure that your names of the objects you're using are very, very different. In this case, I'm using the word ball and the word frisbee, so those don't sound alike, so that will help make this a lot easier. Now I've got two objects that I've worked really hard to teach just a single word on. I'm going to use my verbal cues at this point, and again, ignoring any behaviors that I don't want, that don't meet that verbal cue. If you rush and get to the two objects too quickly, it's easy just to go back to one. Make sure that you're having a lot of success. If you're not, your dog's going to get frustrated and you're going to get frustrated. And so it's then important to go back to just a single object. Make sure when you're having the two objects, you're testing them out. You're testing out the different words. You're placing the objects in different places. Sometimes the frisbee's on the left or right. And pay attention to what your dog's looking at when you say a word. You might be able to predict that they're going to be right or wrong based on what they're looking at, and that's important to start to understand as well. So I play with the two objects for a long time because this is a hard enough challenge as it is before introducing any more. The goal of the trick is to discriminate multiple objects. I would say a minimum of 3. So what I'm going to do is, as I continue to work on my 2, I'm going to also be thinking about my third object I'm going to be introducing. And again, it's important to think about the verbal cue you're going to use. So speaking of third object, I like to introduce the third object in the same way with the 2 objects. I like to pick one that is pretty consistent and do my pairs. This is after I've introduced the third object as its own standalone object first. So every object gets introduced by itself, and then I only work in pairs until I have an understanding in the situation of pairs. And then I can finally go to putting all 3 objects together. Again, continue to mix up the placement of the objects so that they're not always in the same, so your dog doesn't get pattern trained. And that's how you teach your dog to discriminate objects.